So a little bit about myself in regards to how it relates to peers and clinicians training. So I'm the founder of Norooz Clinic Foundation, which for the past 12 years has provided affordable mental health care and treatment, as well as like testing to the greater public here in Orange County. And so as such, I've been involved at all levels of mental health care, if you will, both as a clinical psychologist and supervisor. I've trained more than 90 therapists and psychologists over the past 12 years, and also worked in the field with clients and different, let's say, types of clients at different levels. Now, especially when it comes to the dual diagnosis field, for some of you that have worked in the field, you know that and it's not exclusively limited to dual diagnosis, but specifically, a very, very challenging area of peers and clinicians coming together, sometimes by design, sometimes by necessity. That's where I have learned most of what we will be presenting today together with Orlando. So having pointed toward that necessity of including both clinicians as well as peer support specialists, that's when a year and a half ago, Orlando and I got together, and with his lived experience as very much a peer support specialist for many, many years, we both noticed that we need to do this. So Orlando shared a little bit about himself, but certainly as we are presenting here, he and I will interchangeably switch to present these different aspects. From a clinician's aspect, that I have more or less embodied for the past 16 years, I have always noticed that there is a particular, not necessarily surprising, to me it was surprising, but just kind of a prevalent, almost battle going on between clinicians and peer support. Now, peer support, especially peer support specialists, and or interchangeably the general label of peers, is a new word, right? In the maybe 10, 15 years, when I was really working with peer support specialists, especially in the dual diagnosis with substance use folks, the going term for providers, service providers, so to say, or care providers who were not necessarily therapists and or clinically trained, was more of a recovery worker. That was the going term. And many times also there were case workers or case managers. So a bunch of terms that are kind of being thrown around. But ultimately, what we distinguish here is a group of people who are more or less academically trained. They go through very rigorous clinical training at these established institutions, academic institutions, and then they go through thousands of hours of more or less empirical internship experience, and then have to get licensed. It's not just a certification. They have to get a very specific license to be allowed to work in this field. And then there is this other group. So however many labels we want to use, but the other group that actually they more or less go through some type of a training, but it can be much shorter. It's not necessarily at this higher education institutions. It can be more of a specialty focus, a training that is related to particular aspects of health care in different settings. But the biggest value really that these other service providers again bring in beyond training is the actual lived experience. So having said that, we have decided to create this new organization, Peers and Clinicians Collaborative Alliance. So it's an actual nonprofit organization for this particular purpose, to bring peers and clinicians together, rather than being acquiescent to that battle, the adversarial positioning that takes place in the field, where a lot of peer support specialists, again, I'm going to use the newest term here, peer support specialists are not very fond of working with clinicians. They have their own issues, concerns, biases, projections, impressions, judgments, conclusions, and so forth that they bring with themselves, and also vice versa. Clinicians do the same. So Orlando and I decided not to follow that norm. And what we want to do is actually not bifurcate, not separate, not distance these two distinct camps from each other, because ultimately it is a disservice to the community and to the clients. We don't want clients to get conflicting, confusing, opposing messages. We want them to get more or less a very comprehensive message that is aligned with their ultimate goal, and that these two camps of service providers come together and align themselves for the effective success in treatment. I'm going to pause on that and let Orlando also chime in a little bit, and then we get into the nitty-gritty.
Sure. No problem. Thanks, Dr. G. No, absolutely. The main reason I'm here is for peers. So I selfishly align myself with Dr. G, really looking for the best interest. I'm pretty straight up, as you can tell. I'm the peer side of this. There's really no a major separation here between us. At the same time, we do see eye to eye in regards to the community and those that we're serving. And we both realize that this battle that we've had between the peers and clinicians need to really be addressed. And I think what we've done is we've taken this and created a not only a curriculum, but also an environment where this is now flourishing. So this is actually flourishing because I'm actually starting to like some clinicians, where most of the time I have not, I don't see. Yeah, I don't see them as arrogant as I used to see them, or maybe as, looking down on peers. And again, I'm here as a peer advocate, really fighting for, peers to be involved in every aspect of behavioral health. That's the reason that Peer Voices was created. As many other organizations like SHARE and others have been involved, throughout this SB 803, where California being one of the last states to really be part of the peer certification. So we've come in California very, very lastly, but not because of anything other than just the certification. The work has been done here for a very long time, kind of undercover. And I think now it's starting to take, as California always does, we're going to take the lead in many areas, even though we started way behind everyone else. We're going to take the lead. And one of the things that we're taking a lead on is on this peer and clinician kind of curriculum and aspect. So anyway, let's get moving so we can kind of share a little bit. We don't want to bore everyone with a little bit of the curriculum. We do like the interaction. I think that's really where we really our strength as peers, and we're starting to see also with clinicians, they also have that same strength if they're invited. So we're inviting both peers and clinicians to really chime in. Thank you.
Absolutely. So with that, we already stated the problem, that these camps kind of constantly almost fight with each other and go against each other and don't see eye to eye, to put it in kind of blunt terms. And with our background, we thought we are really actually quite capable of bridging that gap. We are doing it with each other. We are doing it with our own interns that we supervise Orlando too has a more experienced, certified peer support specialist, certainly has other peer support staff that he supervises, and then I supervise more or less both. So we have thought about, well, how can we go about this to really help these folks come together? Well, a lot of it has to do with basically understanding and learning about each other. Well, one area that they can learn about one another and each other's differences is basically their core competencies. Their core competencies are different. So for psychotherapists, very quickly, and we're going to go through this very, very quickly so we can really get to the end slide, which is digging deep at the supervisory challenges, being, the topic of the day. But very quickly, psychotherapists are basically trained for many, many years to do a thorough job at assessment and treatment planning, and not just planning part of it, but also the execution. So the provision of treatment. And also there are some legal ramifications, right? We will get to that briefly in a few other slides. But that's another aspect that therapists, psychotherapists, and by the way, it's not just therapists. That's why we prefer to use the word clinicians, even though there are different nuances between them, whether somebody is for instance, a therapist or a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a nurse practitioner or a physician assistant or and so forth and so on, right? But generally, they have certain credentialing and authority to basically perform certain tasks. One of them, in terms of a formal diagnosis and treatment plan, for instance, falls under the clinician's purview. So that's as far as the core competency of clinicians is concerned. But then when it comes to peers, it's not like they don't have any core competencies. They do too, right? It's just different. And that's what we are trying to work with our students and trainees to understand that. So very quickly, Orlando, do you want to address the
Sure. No, and of course, I'm not going to drown everyone with all 17 core competencies based on DHCS and all of those that are in California, based on SB 803 and everything that came to fruition. So, definitely the core competencies that are in there really do not address the issues of the relationship in the system, especially with clinicians. So I think that's one of the areas that I believe we're tapping into deeper and creating that, because, those core competencies are standalone for peers, but at the same time that they really does overlap in the clinical side. So from that perspective, that's really one of the areas that I find more interesting in especially in the core competencies, because peers definitely benefit from that.
Very good. And historically, they have had two different trajectories. So for clinicians, it's been, I'll get to that, but for very quickly, for the interest of time, the trajectory for peers has been more or less almost like in the past, maybe 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago, even if you go back all the way to the core idea of including peers, which goes back to almost the social recovery model, the AA and the anonymous group, support groups who have been there in addition to a therapist or a treatment specialist. But I believe over time it has gained more credibility, more support from government organizations, from other institutes, and then most recently, as Orlando mentioned, has really gained great traction, where everybody now is on the same page that yes, the peer support specialists are important aspect of treatment, and also they're going through their own trainings and gaining core competencies. With clinicians, it's been more long-lasting, maybe not just the past 50 to 50 plus years, but really goes back to centuries, if not millennia, of a tradition of training the professional, the expert, the designated healthcare physician, so to say, to provide that expert treatment. And so there are universities, there's scientific organizations, training institutes that are behind that, and ultimately licensing bodies such as, let's say, Board of Behavioral Sciences or Board of Psychology. And then, there are also government organizations like regulatory bodies like DHCS or DMH and so forth that have always given credence and authority to clinicians. That's kind of where the history maybe a little bit different, but ultimately they both come together now and almost are creating a shared history.
And if I could add just to what you said, because it brings up in my mind what you just mentioned about clinicians. It brings up in my mind the amount of credibility that they've received, but also the structure is also so rigid. It has been so rigid based on the scientific aspect of it, that I think that also that strength can also become its weakness. And I think that's what we're also addressing here.
Absolutely. So definitely. So throughout, just FYI for our audience, we have started this January 2023. And then the training really, the first quarter we took in putting the curriculum together, and then the actual training, weekly training for 3 hours every week started February last year, 2023. So we have now literally completed about a year of weekly trainings with our clinicians and peers. So in our trainings, we have usually 10, 12 peers and clinicians who come in and hash out these issues and details. And as Orlando mentioned, we get to see both the pros and cons of all these aspects that we bring up. It's not just always strengths, with all these types of historical aspects of the personality and the roles and obligations and duties and acumen that both peers and clinicians bring in. There's always room for improvement, for learning, for criticism, and we incorporate that, weave that into our training. Another aspect of it is that we again dig deeper into is what are the roles and purposes for peers and clinicians. Orlando?
Yeah, hey, hold on a second. See, of course, I clicked on something. The roles of peers. I mean, I think in today's world, probably the roles of peers have definitely changed as they've gotten more involved in the whole behavioral health. They are part of the whole behavioral health system, although we are still on the beginning stages, or at least in the beginning of really how much they can do and how are they collaborating with the clinician. And I think that's where, again, based on everything that I've experienced and everything that we do in the community, when we are addressing these issues with clinicians, although we are accepted and they are open to having the input and the support, it's still just at that part where it's not completely open to those ideas and concepts. And again, based on the fact that we don't understand the clinical side and maybe some of those issues that are actually being handled in the clinical side and the liability that they are holding on to. So I think that right now peers are actually, the roles of peers are everywhere. And again, I'm including community health workers because that's another area that we're struggling with kind of, figuring out, are these community health workers or are they peers? Well, in my eyes, they're all peers and they do community health work. But again, that's something that California is still trying to figure out. So from me, as far as the roles, and have always been the same, and it's throughout all the states, which is really promoting recovery and wellness, being that support and being that navigation through the mental health, the behavioral health system in simple terms. So I don't complicate it much more than that.
Very good. And we also know that many of these aspects, like these roles and purpose, also go hand in hand with the other aspects of the functionality and the presence of individuals involved, such as, clinicians, they're more or less interacting with clients as needed and very structured, very limited time frame. That relationship is more defined, more structured, more just kind of limited to the bare minimum, the necessity of, for instance, weekly therapy, let's say, once a week. And sometimes it varies, right? If you're an intensive outpatient program or a hospital or a detox center and so forth, it could be 8 hours a day. But, interactions. But in general, it is a sporadic, very infrequent type of meetings. Whereas here, what we want to emphasize is that that's where peer support specialists have actually possibly fulfilled a much richer, type of a presence and have had a deeper impact with clients because as they are more available and more frequently intensely interacting with clients, they're also much more, let's say, impactful in the promotion of that recovery and wellness, the enhancement of self-determination and so forth, simply because the relationship itself has a little bit of a different quality. Now, for clinicians,
there are pros and cons to that, right? I mean, there's definitely pros and cons, to both of those. And one of the areas that we just recently touched on, not to throw you off, is really the fact that yes, peers almost are considered a friend, but at the same time, the issue becomes now: are we a good friend? Does a good friend just kind of listen to you forever, or are they also trying to help you to move to the next step? So I think in simple terms, that's kind of like what I've seen, especially with clinicians that are really fearing the fact that they're not really there for themselves and they're there for the client, and wanting them or desiring to at least give them the opportunity to have a good plan to maybe move forward. So I think that kind of is a distinction I wanted to make there.
Yeah, and with that too, what we hope that the audience and generally people we train recognize is that due to very much these different histories and background and possibly also their own core beliefs that could be activated at times, peers and clinicians fulfill their roles differently. And for clinicians, it really usually follows a very structured model-based type of approach. They have always like a very scientifically oriented and kind of clinically grounded roadmap in mind how to fulfill their roles, whereas the peer support specialists, they have less of this rigidity, let's say, in the back of their mind. They're much more relaxed and also more smooth and more natural in their approach of almost like fulfilling the same purpose, because both clinicians and peer support specialists, they want to be helpful. They want to provide some type of a, let's say, set of experiences. Sometimes these experiences are more, lived experiences. Other times they're textbook, model, scientific experiences. But ultimately, it's about certain awareness, skill set, competence that we want to convey to the clients for their improvement. So now where it gets tricky is in that intersection at the clinical practice. So when these two groups are coming together and we want to, for instance, really take care of some clients, and the way we go about it can create that gap that we mentioned, and we want to be here to bridge that gap through the education, through the just these trainings that highlight these differences, but also point toward the benefit of collaboration with each other. Beyond the historical aspect, competence, and roles and purposes, we also highlight laws and regulations that are different. For peers, there are certain now more and more regulatory bodies that also are creating certain guidelines for peers to follow. But for psychologists, therapists, social workers, there's always been very well established guidelines, ethics codes, business and profession code, and other types of codes and regulations for them to follow.
And Dr. G, if I can interject, I think I was just interject real quick. I think some of the fact that they are so highly regulated, not to say that clinicians use that against peers, but it is definitely in the back of their minds when they are, dealing with peers. At the end of the day, no matter, you can't get away from the fact that a clinician is going to look at a peer and say, well, my license is on I have these things that I have to address before I actually can address what your concerns are. So I have to protect my license first. I have to make sure that I'm following all of the guidelines that I've been trained to do. That is before they even speak to a peer. So I think that's part of what we're discussing here.
Yes, and these fears, to some extent, they're being triggered over and over again throughout the interactions that they have with each other. One aspect of it, I think, for instance, we will get to it here when it comes to the application of delivery of services, where, for instance, let's say if there are therapy groups or support groups, and then now you have a clinician and a peer come together to employ certain things such as confidentiality. How do you deal with confidentiality within a therapy group or support group, or even outside of it, right? That's where a clinician sometimes mostly has a legal and code-based perspective and approach, whereas a peer may not, right? And it goes back to that again, that value of experience, because peers, emphasize the importance of their role, of their participation, of their interaction with the clients differently.
I did want to jump in real quick to the experiences that you had just put right prior to this, which is, we over a year of watching and being and participating in both peers and clinicians doing, for example, support groups. It has been quite an interesting experience, because honestly, most clinicians support groups can be kind of boring. I hate to say that. And that's just my own personal opinion based on a lot of, going to see a lot of clinicians do support groups. Now, when a clinician actually applies some of the principles that peers use, and they actually have, and many of them are wonderful. There's some amazing clinicians that have bridged that gap, and that's the same gap that we're trying to bridge for both. They actually are quite amazing, because not only do they have the educational aspect and can, support them in many areas, they actually can also, have that human quality that I think sometimes they are not able to show in these support groups. Especially if it's more of a clinical type of support group, like an outpatient, type of support group. Those type of things they struggle with. So I've seen such an incredible shift in the way that clinicians are now doing support groups. So
Yes,
it's
and
been pretty amazing to see.
yes, and as you mentioned, like for instance, let's say the humanity, right, the human side. Like if we, this is the thing, there is no consensus on whether or not, one group is doing it the right way. For instance, if we want to empathize, right? When we empathize with the client, the peer support specialist does it differently than the clinician. Now, one may seem boring versus the other. The one may seem, more structured, rigid, or out of place than the other. But that's where our training and education comes in, because what we want to do is help therapists or, again, clinicians understand better how these same phenomena, such as confidentiality, respect, diversity, empathizing, kind of being a productive member of the treatment team, etc., play out from a peer support specialist's perspective and from their own experiences, rather than just remain critical about it. And
if
vice
they're
versa.
not addressed, yeah, and Dr. G, if these issues within your own organization, in my own personal opinion, again, if these issues are not addressed within your own organization and have these type of conversations, these type of trainings, these type of interactions, you are going to find that divide. But the divide can be conquered and definitely improved upon. Of course, everyone getting different results, but at the same time, I think we've come to realize in our, this whole experience between peers and clinician, we've actually come to realize that both camps do care. Both camps are just addressing things differently. And it doesn't make sense to have that separation, especially with the need of both participating and supporting that consumer.
Yes, and we do have a schedule. So every week, so we have almost a 12-week cycle where we have the peers and clinicians come in and go through all these concepts one week at a time. As I mentioned, there is 3 hours each week, split into 3 parts. The first part is really just reviewing the curriculum and the laws, regulations, the history, stuff like that. The second part is an actual group facilitation. So we believe in learning by doing, where we have clinicians and peers co-facilitate a conversation, a group, and it's almost a therapy group for the purpose of learning from each other. And that's basically the gist of our training and education, where we believe that by exposing these the different folks to each other's ways and opening a room and space for conversation and brainstorming, we are then really actually training and helping them learn about one another's differences and appreciate it, because ultimately what's has been done in the field is that these different groups have stopped at criticizing each other. They have not learned how to move ahead and beyond that criticism. And unfortunately, criticism always leads to defense, and basically people just separate and distance each other, from each other. And that's what we have. The status quo is almost like this isolation and insulation from one another.
And I've
so,
seen this transformation, Dr. G. In these trainings, I've seen incredible transformation where a lot of the clinicians that came in the beginning, peers, they don't really need music to have a party. They come in and they end up having a great time, and they, are very open to whatever it is. And then we started out, and it was just an incredible experience to watch. And we had this whole camp of clinicians, and they appeared to us, based on what we were observing, that they were a little bit on the stiffer side of the spectrum when it came to, what was going on. But during this process, we have actually seen, and I've seen personally, clinicians who now you can't distinguish them from a peer. It's really quite interesting. It's a real weird transformation. So I really have seen that the 3 hours that we do, as boring as that may sound, as actually not boring, and it actually has a lot of value where you can come in at any part of those 3 hours. Of course, we'd love to have as much time as you can possibly give, and take as much as you possibly can from it. But that experience of being able to actually deliver a presentation and practice it in a safe environment, which is exactly the whole premise of what peers do, is creating it. So we're creating a safe environment for clinicians.
Well said.
You like that one?
I like that.
I just thought of that.
Very good. I like that one. So within this training, so what we delve into is basically what happens at the application of at the intersection of these people coming together in the field. So if there are support groups, if there are 12-step groups, therapy groups, for instance, what is the friction about? How do these folks kind of maybe bump into each other? How do they, end up possibly disliking each other's ways? And we open that up. So we have discussions and communication around that. And like Orlando said, it's kind of really enjoyable because you see these two different camps almost like trying to run away from each other. It's almost like see this resistance that everyone comes in wanting to follow a right versus wrong principle. Oh no, you shouldn't do this stuff this way, and you should follow my way. And by the way, I'm really kind of exhausted by this process, so I rather not get involved and just go and run to my own group of people, my own folks that I feel like I belong to, and not have anything to do with you guys who are different. And we do
And
the
traditionally,
opposite.
I was just going to say, traditionally, peers have been somewhat intimidated by, which we haven't addressed, with clinicians. So I think to some degree, or a major degree of this, is actually being able to, empower the peer, and not as if the clinician is holding them back, but just based on the fact that we're doing everything at the same time for peers to be able to empower them, to be able to give them that confidence to actually see the value that they have, and they're actually reflecting it on a different level with clinicians. So they're actually looking and empowering themselves on a much higher level than just seeing themselves measuring within peer to peer, that type of peer empowerment. So this is like peer clinical empowerment.
It is, and there are very specific topics that we see this come to the fore, very tangible way. For instance, let's say de-escalation of clients. If clients are kind of at their last piece of patience, and they just can't take it anymore, whether it's a treatment center, whether it is a homework or something assignment or whatever it is that they need to do, but they just want to give up, and they're escalated in their emotional state. Peers go about it completely different than clinicians.
Did you want to go a little bit more into the peer and clinician? Because I think peer and clinician and training, but more in the supervision of peers, especially in the setting and how it relates to clinicians. Because, of course, both camps want to maintain that, the professional standards. As we all know, there's also the skill development that we're also always, developing. The quality assurance, all of those things, support and well-being. But I think when it comes to the peer and clinician aspect of the supervision, definitely the clinician, especially if they are supervising a peer, which is not the way that in California we would like to see things. It definitely want to have a peer who has that certification to be able to deliver that supervision. But I think that it is a little more possible for a clinician to supervise, which in some aspects, whether they realize it or not, they are supervising a peer, especially if they are in case management, they are supervising a peer. But if they have no knowledge of how a peer functions and how a peer, what a peer needs, those type of things, a peer brings a lot to the workforce, but there are many challenges that a clinician has no idea because of their training and the way that they present and the way that they are, obligated based on their training and their, the regulations that they're on following. They really don't have a clue as far as how peers are best served.
Yeah, absolutely. And then the few examples that are highlighted here come to mind is those are just kind of the hallmarks of where all this friction takes place. And whether it is between a clinical supervisor and a non-clinical supervisee, like a peer support specialist, and or any other type of variations, let's say when boundaries are crossed, these two groups kind of go about repair or even respect or maintenance of boundaries differently. When it comes down to dual relationships, they do things differently. When it comes down to self-disclosure, they do things differently. So with that in mind, let's get into those supervision challenges. So this is where we want to possibly spend the rest of the presentation on, and then open up for conversation here with our audience. So first thing that stands out is the role confusion. And we know that what we already covered really is just the tip of the iceberg, right? When we are talking about roles, purpose, responsibilities, and so forth. So here, one of the biggest challenges for supervisors is to be able to clarify these things for both camps. And again, that may be hard because, as Orlando said earlier, what if you're a peer support certified peer support specialist, and then you're working with peer support staff, but also you're working with clinicians, and there is a little bit of an inherent imbalance in terms of, again, authority to supervise, maybe hierarchy of positions, training, abilities, competence, and so forth. But beyond that, again, the opportunity exists for supervisors to be able to cross these gaps by simply providing a better clarification, to remove these role confusions. And that's why we believe that our training is very unique, because, if you follow, let's say, the supervision models that clinicians usually follow, there's not much of a discussion about how to supervise a peer support specialist. Just generally, clinicians don't necessarily learn that because they're supposed to supervise other clinicians, right? But in reality, as Orlando said, if you are a clinician out there in the field, structurally part of an organizational structure, you may be assigned to that task because there's nobody else around, and you're the clinical supervisor, but also their peer support specialist staff that are there to help out, and they also need to be supervised. But their whole experience, the whole reality is somewhat different than the realities of clinicians, right? And then don't be surprised that maybe even, again, based on the setting, it is possible to see that a peer support specialist, especially a certified one, may be pushed into the position of possibly even supervising, let's say, clinical interns, not necessarily by, from a legal perspective, not from a regulatory perspective, but based on the realities on the ground, right? If there are a shortage of staff, that's an example. So role confusion becomes very, very important here. Now, there are other aspects that we can get into. power dynamics. Again, I kind of addressed that as well. There's a power imbalance, whether it goes back to the official curricula of training and so forth, or even the perceptions that exist. As Orlando mentioned, peers have this inherent understanding that, oh, these clinicians have more power, and we are not good enough or capable enough and so forth. And at times, actually, I turned it around. Like in our trainings, we bring this up and turn it around and say, well, take it from a clinician's perspective that they sometimes believe that the peer support specialists have more power. They may not have like a power by authority, but they have power by their presence or by their lived experience or by their comfort of connecting with others, whereas the
That's a good
clinician may
point.
not have that, right?
That is a good point. I've seen
In
that.
their power dynamics, the supervisors need to be aware of. The communication styles are extremely important, and you can speak about that as well. I would say from a clinician perspective, we really are trained to deliver a very methodical approach toward communication. And when it comes to listening, empathizing, paraphrasing, restating, and then the content. It's the process, but also the content of communication. Like we tend to always follow a guideline of, the conversation needs to be about the client.
I
Not
found that
about
really
the
interesting, by the
person,
way. We
about
had
the
a great discussion on that where clinicians were actually describing the fact that if they were communicating that the peer, it would appear, no pun intended, would appear to be really focused on them and not really the client. So I think there's a really separate camp when it comes to that. The clinician is looking at this and it's like, well, this is not about me. I'm just here to listen. And although listening is definitely a great tool, peers definitely, of course, chime in on their lived experience when required or when it's appropriate. And I think the appropriateness of that sharing and maybe speaking a little bit more than necessary, or maybe not focusing on the consumer, it is really more relevant when you see the peer and clinician and how they deal with things differently.
Yes, and one thing I can share with everybody here, because again, at least over the past year and a half, officially to the Peers and Clinicians Collaborative Alliance, but also unofficially, I would say over the past 12 years, I have been involved in supervising therapists, interns, peer support specialists, and so forth. So, when I came across all these areas of conflict, areas of friction, and possible lack of collaboration, the pattern that I have noticed, and then as a supervisor, that's what I have focused on, is a immediate type of emotional reactivity from both camps, to the extent of almost becoming part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So my approach has always been, as a supervisor, to stop the person in their tracks. And by tracks, I mean their own biases, their own conclusions, their own what we call transference, more or less, or projections, and really have them start taking a different approach, a more open-minded, inclusive, collaborative approach. So that's what I do usually, in order to almost like the gateway into a better understanding and learning, is to start actually examining those biases that may have. If it is a peer support specialist or a clinician, doesn't matter, whoever comes into me and says, oh, Dr. G, you know what happened in their group yesterday? This person said this, and the client was upset, and I can't believe how that co-facilitator took care of this situation. That was unbelievable. They're breaking rules, laws, regulations, or they're completely incompetent, and blah blah blah, whatever it may be. That's an example, and it comes up almost once or twice a week. And how I go about it is say, okay, well, let's examine it. Let's see what's going on, rather than immediately jumping to citing a code or a law or whatever it is, such as HIPAA regulations. But we really dig deep into it and say, okay, well, what really happened? What do you think should have happened? What's the evidence behind it? Do you know what this other person was coming from? What were their logic and reasoning? And let's understand that better, and to actually just kind of expand the conversation so that then we can have a more comprehensive understanding of those nuances. So with that in mind, I really want to, unless you have something to add, Orlando, I wanted to just
No,
kind of
I'm
open
good.
the
I wanted to see
conversation.
him open it up. I wanted to open up.
Yeah.
I just want to leave with a really quick note that with peers, especially in this area of supervision, and is quite challenging. And I think peers will definitely benefit from peers and clinicians in the aspect of that when a clinician is working with a client, he has very clear guidelines, which I think a lot of times from my perspective as a peer, we just kind of jump in, sometimes without a parachute, because that's the community that we really address. But that's not always the best case, and that sometimes can also hurt us as peers and where we're at, and from a peer perspective, we have to always go back to the peer and make sure that that peer is taking time for themselves, and the supervising aspect of what they're doing has to be addressed, from the debriefing on a daily basis to making sure that what they're doing and they're reflecting, because the peer has to continually grow to develop. And that development is through the supervision. So anyway, with that, I wanted to open it up and see if we have questions.
Yeah.
I think Larry has, I believe, a question there. Hello.
Yes, let's go with Larry.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm a peer, and my job title is peer case manager. I work on a multidisciplinary team that's funded by the DHS. The DHS has this whole kind of umbrella program called Housing for Health. And I do street outreach and case management with the idea of getting people in permanent supportive housing. Now, I'm a peer. My supervisor is an LCSW. Well, actually, I had to take the day off from work today to come to this conference. And the fact that I'm at this conference and not my supervisor should kind of tell you a bit there. And
it's your problem.
Yeah, it's my problem. Yeah. No, it actually is my problem, because I'm trying to figure out, there's very much a social work mentality in the nonprofit that I work for. And it's my problem to navigate peer values and practices into a social work context. And it's very difficult. And I wouldn't say that there's conflict between my supervisor and me, but there's definitely tension. And the way that I see it is, clinicians are obviously highly trained and experienced people. They have a particular standpoint, all right, from which they view people whose needs they serve. I, as a peer, simply have a different standpoint from which I view people whose needs I attempt to serve. And to my mind, those two views can be complementary.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I'm trying to achieve with my supervisor. But one of the biggest problem that I have in trying to do that with my supervisor is that, to my supervisor, being a peer simply means I'm a person with lived experience. In other words, I'm just basically an AA sponsor, who's getting paid or something. I don't know what but and I try to explain to him, look, I was very well trained in peer philosophy, peer values, peer practices, and very specific tools that I have at my disposal that I would like to bring to the team that the other people on the team don't have. And I've had this conversation with my supervisor and my supervisor's supervisor and my supervisor's supervisor, asking them how can I best complement in this multidisciplinary team. And the answers that I got indicated to me that, and they're all clinicians, they all have licenses. The overriding thing for me is that these people who I'm talking to don't seem to realize the depth of, of being a peer. The depth of the peer philosophy, the depth of peer values, the depth of peer tools and peer work. They see it as just like a glorified AA sponsor, basically.
Well, I honestly want to, for time, I do want to take a couple other questions, but I did want to say, Larry, first of all, I definitely sympathize with you. I've been through the same type of experiences. You are being really very kind. I don't know if I would be as kind as you in the way that I would handle it. But I think it's really quite sad to hear that, because, for them to say that, your lived experience is just that, is really minimizing the whole industry, the whole peer concept. And I think at that point, he needs to really almost be retrained, and maybe he would benefit from this peer clinician, and definitely having a discussion with Dr. G, for example, because he's actually he's not providing the services to the consumer and the client that he needs to serve. So in some ways, my biggest challenge to him would be, you're not serving your client. If there's a new medication, or if there's a new process or new system that will help your client, and you refuse because that's not the way you were trained, I mean, what do you want to call that? And that's the way I would kind of approach him. I'm going to be honest. I would be very quite not militant, but definitely very, in the personality that you have, continue to battle with that, because I feel that he's not providing the services.
Person, I'm anyway. You get the idea. You get the drift. I don't want to.
Of course.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Next one, Stephanie has her hand up.
Hi everyone, I'm Stephanie Aiken. So I run a recovery navigator program over here in Clown County in a rural community. And I live in the area that, I had my own trouble in. And the peers that I have on my program with that lived experience, it's been really hard because they were friends kind of in the past, and having that supervision role to the friend role, and then making everyone feel that I have a same open door policy and there's no favorites. Like, I have the same expectations for everyone across the board, but it seems to come out to where my peers are, they want me to notice them. And I do really hard to do reward system, and, we have our team meetings, we give kudos. But my challenge is that with the different personalities, with the lived experience on all different levels of it, I have a hard time when it comes to the constructive criticism, because they automatically feel like I'm attacking them, and then it's the end of the world.
Yeah, I sympathize with that. And as a peer, I can definitely relate to that. I'm sure Dr. G can as well, with what he's supervised. But for me, I'm just going to give you my really quick, feelings on this. I would say, Stephanie, that in regards to the supervision that you are providing, I think the trainings and the educating them that actually will help them to reduce their stress level. Peers have a lot of stress because we actually take that person and we actually care at such a high level. And sometimes, as wonderful as it is, that could kill you. I mean, that definitely, you don't want to end up hurting those. And that's one of the challenges that we all have in the peer community, is that if you are supervising peers, are you also hurting them and the client? So you're constantly battling those two areas. So for me, I think is empowering them by educating them, and actually some of the techniques that are used in the clinical aspects could be used in what they would use in order to be able to relieve some of that stress, and know that this is not just an emotional, but also a strategic and more scientific approach. So having both could be a good balance for a peer, which we've never had that training. We've always kind of been thrown out there in that aspect. And so I think having both could be very beneficial. Supervision and definitely debriefing them on a regular basis so they can reflect on themselves and see what they're doing is also, of course, wonderful, because as you're supervising, you're also training and you're also empowering them as you make your peers better and then help them to become better of who they want to be. They actually provide better services. So our goal in supervising peers is quite challenging.
Yeah, and to add to that, that's why we invite everybody to actually join our trainings and or promote that like to other people who you believe would benefit from this, because it's a process. It's not just one piece of information that peers or clinicians just to need to read somewhere and then suddenly change and shift their position and understanding and approach toward one another. It's a process of learning and learning something different, something new. And the most difficult part of it really is actually to go through the heat, the difficulty, the painful to some extent, a painful experience of facing our own biases. This is the most, I would say, crucial part, because all of us really are mostly just blinded by our own blind spots. So what we do in the training is we create a safe environment for that, for both peers and clinicians to open up, to be vulnerable, to share with each other, to learn from each other's vulnerability without separating. So ultimately, again, it's human nature to like and dislike, and it's also human nature to make judgments and conclude certain things and have biases. But what happens is that we stop there. We don't go through that process, and so we stop and we separate. That's the problem. What we do here in the training is we invite people not to stop at that juncture, but actually go through the process and not separate. With that in mind, Stephen, you had your hand up.
Yeah. Hey, I just wanted to say that there are some clinicians that don't understand peers because they assume that peers aren't qualified, or just because we're not licensed as a clinician. But peers still are licensed, and we are. I'm sorry, I'm in a room where we just have a large room, and it's not a single room. However, we have licenses, we have lived experience, we are equipped, as well as our lived experience, with some training, and like I have a degree and all those other things. So when we establish some boundaries and let the clinicians know we're not trying to be the clinician, we are clearly the peer support coming along with our lived experience as well as our academic experience, then that kind of maybe settles the differences, so that clinicians don't feel like we're trying to take over their role or when they're trying to supersede them, but we just really want to work alongside them. It's a quick reminder of when I was in the military, spent 25 years in there, and chaplains assistants weren't working together, but yet we were working towards the same goal. And so it's really just establishing those boundaries and saying we're here to work together to reach the veteran, and that's our number one goal.
Very good.
Yeah, I think we forget that. I think at the end of the day, I think both peers and clinicians, do have the consumer, the client in mind. But I think the challenges on the peer side is that imbalance that we talked about. But just having an open discussion on some of these in your own organization could be very beneficial. Just the fact that you're bringing this to the table and saying, hey, here are the clinicians and here's the peers. We need to do a better job together. Even if you did not do the training, even if you just took some of this information and took it back to your organization, I think that in itself is quite useful. And I would encourage everyone to start having those discussions within their own organization to really bring this topic. And that's going to help the peer, because the peer, again, is really providing a lot of areas that a clinician cannot. 30 minutes, 45 minutes of of clinical work, maybe 15 minutes of psychiatric if the client is on that, and maybe a few minutes here and there is not the same as peers, providing, months of support and navigation until they can move into that recovery. So, I mean, it's almost now both are necessary. Two different jobs, both require collaboration.
Yeah, and to add to that, our idea here for us is to emphasize the complementary approach, right? The complementarity, and the fact that actually there is no call or mandate for one group to turn and convert into another one. Orlando has brought that up many, many times, that there is almost this push, or maybe unspoken, or I don't know, but somehow a pull or push toward turning peers into clinicians. And there is none. There is no mandate for that. And neither is there a mandate for all the clinicians to suddenly, become peer support, folks. It's the idea here that we want to bring up over and over again is that each of these groups have great things to contribute that are unique, that are distinct, and they're different, they're diverse, and they may go against each other at times, but they still, all of us can benefit, and in the end, the client benefits from this collaborative approach. And in order to be able to overcome that friction, that intense type of interaction that occurs when it comes to these differences, we need continual training. We can't just follow a certain written guideline somewhere that says, oh, diversity is good, fine, or listening is great, or understanding is fantastic. Okay, these are all theoretical things. But when it comes to actually doing it, we have to practice the skill set of overcoming our biases.
I think you have a hand up, Dr. G,
Yes,
just I know for
yes.
sake of time. Thank you.
Mr. Gutierrez.
Hi, Doctor. Hi, Orlando.
Hi.
Basically, what I want to say is that the differences, in my opinion, between a clinician and a lived experience peer specialist is that, I think everyone has lived experience. That's what I hear from clinicians. Everyone has lived experience, but the depth and the lived experience that the peer has is at a greater level than a clinician does. With that said, is because maybe a lot of peer specialists or a lot of community health workers didn't have the funds or the resources or the financials to go to university. So it doesn't mean that we don't have that education. A lot of us learn differently. A lot of us learn hands-on. So there's been times when I went to college, I really didn't even open a book, and I passed the exams. Why? Because I have a good short-term memory, good long-term memory. So a lot of us learn different ways. A lot of peers are very multi-talented, are educated. Like our gentleman just spoke. Yeah, I also have a college degree as well, and I have the certified peer specialist, and I work for a government agency in California, and I've been there almost 22 years. So with that lived experience, it also comes from where you grew up at, your environment, what you saw, what you didn't see. Did you suffer PTSD because it was a bad area? There was gunfire and shootings and killings. So at the end of the day, it makes you a well-rounded person when you have the education behind you, you have the lived experience behind you, you have the street knowledge, you're very well versed. You're never trying to take the clinician's position. All you want is the clinician's respect. We're not the person that's going to go bring you a coffee. We're not the person that's going to be your little errand boy. Because at the end of the day, sometimes it feels like peers get disrespected when clinicians treat them like a personal assistant. We're not that. We're not a personal assistant that's gonna go bring you papers and do this, give me this from the copy machine, and it's a consistent disrespect in a governmental environment, public or private. All we want is respect. We have that knowledge that sometimes the clinicians can't do. You can go. I worked in super lockdown psych facilities, psych asylums with criminals, felons, super high acuity, super high level of the highest care, higher than you know, the FSP program, where clinicians couldn't de-escalate the person, but you with lived experience, you can meet them where you're at, because you know what you're talking about. You lived that experience, whether it was drugs or whatever the case is. You can meet him where he's at, and you can bring him from way up here to way down there, using your verbal de-escalation, which a lot of the stuff that we learn, you can't learn in college or university. So that's what makes it a very,
I'm gonna
very,
chime
very
in on
valuable.
that.
Very
I want
good.
to chime in on that. Thanks
And then
for
we
what
got
you're
to wrap it
saying.
up.
I love it. I want to chime in on that real quick and just tell you that we are going to, peers are giving a run to clinicians. We're giving a run for their money, as the term, as it's said. And the reason why is, as this peer certification, as peers stabilize, as peers empower and be able to have a better relationship with clinicians, many of them are becoming clinicians. Many of them are going back to school. Many of them are returning, and they are also becoming those therapists and clinicians and psychiatrists that they may have not liked very much. So I think that the market and the community is changing tremendously. So, you know, do not allow anyone to put down peers. I think it's really into the service of the client if we allow that. We have a lot to offer, and I think that it doesn't take away. And I don't think clinicians generally are looking to do that, but it has been, unfortunately, that imbalance in power is very relevant, you know, very open. It's there. So I definitely don't let them put you down there.
No,
Yeah.
thank you. And I just want to end it real quick, but the last thing is that I don't take nothing personal. I ever, whether either a clinician or a consumer, because the main goal is to help the consumer, achieve a better life and get better through recovery or through resources, or engaging them with whatever information you have with mental health or homelessness or housing or whatever they need. I think at the end of the day, I'm also part of a peer advisory council where we're creating actual peer item. Right now we're doing, I believe, the manual, and then we're doing the duty statements. It's a team of 10 peer specialists, 1 peer chief, and then 1 medical deputy doctor, psychiatrist, that's in charge of all the other psychiatrists in the government setting. So those 2 leaders, and in the peer perspective, peer specialist on that council is actually creating an item, a regular peer support specialist item, and then also a peer support specialist supervisor item. And I believe they even might make a senior item, which is like a team lead between the peer support specialist and the supervisor. You're still entry level supervisor. So like I said, it's a very, very nice feeling to know that peers are being recognized for their experience, for their education, for their knowledge, and for the wonderful people that they are. So yeah, some people might get a little hurt or offended when you try to supervise them, but you always understand you got to approach it in a peer perspective approach, just like many clinicians have the clinical perspective. That's all. Thank you.
Love it.
Thank you for sharing. I know we're coming to the end. So lastly, one thing I would want to throw in is seemingly commonsensical terms that we refer to, like even right now, and you mentioned respect. They're not as common or as universal. So in our training, we really get into that. When we say respect, what do we mean by respect? There's no universal understanding of respect. There's very cultural, unique perspectives of that, even individual needs when it comes to showing or receiving respect. So please join our trainings. We would love to have you. Thank you for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. G and Orlando, for leading this amazing presentation. I feel like I learned so much. I feel like some of my bias has been encouraged to drop away. It's really been interesting. So thank you so much for bringing it to us. I really see that tension, and I hear about it usually from the peer perspective, in terms of people really struggling with, well, if I'm on a street outreach team and I haven't created a good sense of trust, maybe 3 visits isn't enough, but then the supervisor is looking at their deliverables and their grant requirements, and there's that tension there. Thank you all for your participation. I thought there was some really amazing contributions. Thank you for being so vulnerable with us. I really appreciate that as well. I have posted in the chat a link where you can give some evaluation and feedback on the session. You can request a certificate of attendance. Let me post that one more time in case you missed that.
Olivia, just so for those that may not be able to attend or be part of this, we definitely, you can reach out to us directly and provide some feedback. You may have some incredible things that we can add to what we have. I mean, unless you want to charge us, I mean, send a bill if you have some good feedback or some things that we can improve on. And especially in the training. I mean, Gutierrez has just mentioned some of the things that they're doing. And I read in the chat some of the other things that others are doing. And it does sound as if this is something that is moving forward. And I think it's going to really empower the peers. So I really, like I said, I started this by saying that I'm here for peers, selfishly to empower peers. And that is how I'm going to end.
Thank you, Orlando. We feel that. We feel the love. It's great to hear. And I just love the idea. I feel it's a very peer notion that the way we address conflict is head on. We talk about it. We think about it. We try to learn what respect is. We try to be collaborative. I think that is definitely a peer value and much needed in our field. So, yeah.
Thank you. I really enjoy it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Libby. We appreciate you too.
Thank you, Dr. G, so much.